and others will be coming in from the Commons as well as from outside. Before I introduce Bruce Owen and Tim Sasser, who are here from our denominational headquarters, Mission to the World, I just want to mention a couple of things to you as members. You may or may not be aware that we do have an endowment fund here, a legacy fund that we have named, and we'll begin talking to you about this endowment. We have about $800,000 that just through the years members have given, and we're going to call this endowment fund the Agnus Dei Legacy Fund. Now, the reason why we chose to call this endowment a legacy fund, Agnus Dei Legacy Fund, is that you've probably seen the beautiful rose window, the Agnus Dei window, when you come in. Actually, from the outside, you enter the church in the back, or at night, you see it on our bulletin. It's on the cover of our bulletin here. This window was actually installed in 1988, and it was a generous gift of two sons that their parents, the Weiss family, had raised them in this church, and their parents loved this church. And when their parents passed away, they gave generously, and the benefit is that Agnus Dei window. We've had people all over this city thank us for the Agnus Dei window. They've come down to the church and just said, at night, we love to drive by and we love to look at that window. And just think about the generosity that two sons had to honor their parents. I think about this often when I come into the sanctuary. Some 50 members, they had us in mind. They gave an endowment to us, a generous gift, a legacy that continues to serve the church well beyond their presence as they've gone on to be with the Lord. That's the generous giving heart that the Church of Jesus Christ has always displayed. And so when you listen to this presentation, I wanted you to know that we'll begin to talk to you more about this idea of giving generously to pass the faith to the next generation. Bruce Owens works for MTW, and Tim Sasser is here. Tim, will you stand? Tim is over the Partner Relations Department for MTW, and he lives in Fort Worth, Texas. But he's here, and he'll be speaking tomorrow at that seminar. This is truly a gift to the church, as you were in the early service, Paul Koistra mentioned. But Bruce Owens has been here before. I've met with him. I've gone through this estate planning. It's blessed my family. I look forward to going back through this again with him and being here tomorrow night. And we are thankful that he invests in churches all across the country. You may not know this, though. Christian agencies are often asking Bruce not only for advice, but using him and utilizing him. He's one of the most gifted teachers of this idea of stewardship, but he also is a humble servant. Thank you for being here, Bruce. And we have deacons are going to pass out a packet. It's called A House in Order. If you don't have one, raise your hand and they'll bring you this packet.
Thank you, Mike. Boy, it is a pleasure to be back in Augusta. One of the things that I really like about coming here is because I run. This is one of the best places to run along the river and over the river and down into the park that I've found as I travel. Not quite as good as running across the San Francisco Bridge, but it is a close second, and that's one of the reasons why I come here. Also, the last time we were here, we worked with 50 families from the church. At the end of this presentation, you'll be offered to use the estate and gift design service that Mission of the World offers to the donors, to the constituents, and in a church setting like this. We don't ask you anything in this ministry. It's to help people put their house in order. There are really two purposes for the presentation. One is educational. And really do pray that you never will look at your estate plans the same way after I speak, because we believe estate planning is spiritual before it's mechanical. We're going to talk quite a bit about a biblical basis for estate plan. We're going to look at distribution of your estate. When we no longer need it, when we've gone to be the Lord, what should the distribution look like? We're going to look at some case studies. When I do this presentation at Christian Leadership Association, I call it Case Studies in Stewardship. It gets into a little bit of the bones, the little parts of the elements of a estate design, wills, trusts, so forth. And the last part of this presentation, which we'll actually go through quite quickly, and if you feel like I've gone through it too quickly, you can come back tomorrow at 7 and we'll have more time to go through that. But it's how to give more effectively. How can we give more effectively currently? And how can we give more effectively when we give a distribution out of our estate? So I have a little idea of and the other purpose, I should say this, is to offer you the very confidential and personalized estate design. If you tear out the last sheet in your outline, you also can sign up for this on the app, and John is going to come up and share that later. If you want to use these services, we can give you an inventory form that is paper, or we'll send you an electronic one, and you'll fill that out about where you are today, not tomorrow, not 3 years ago, 3 years from now, but where you are today on November 7th. And what we'll do when we come back, we'll deliver your estate design. As I mentioned, 50 families went through this the last time we were here. It has a spiritual paradigm in it. We're going to talk about that. It'll have your estate data where you are today, very confidential. And then it has a design. You know, before you build a house, you don't slap up 2x4s or pour concrete. You go to somebody, draw a picture of a house. This is the design for an estate. And once you do this, we deliver it to you. There's only two outcomes. One, you're affirmed in a safe setting, your house is in order. Or if you need to make changes, you go to your other advisors, possibly attorney, to actually do that. And so again, it's a service to help you be affirmed that your house is in order or make changes. Excuse me. So if I have a little idea of the demographic in the room, how many of you have minor dependent children? Oh, just a few? Okay, I guess maybe we can see who's outside. How many of you have adult children out of the nest on their own? Okay. How many of you have adult children that behave like minor dependent children? How many of you are grandparents? Good bit. How many of you are like me? And my wife sort of wish we could have had them first. You know, that it is. What is the role of grandparents? Well, this gives me an idea to talk a little bit about guardianship. In what we do talk a lot about trusts. There's children's trust, there's a revocable trust, living trust, and there are charitable trusts that can make taxes optional. But let's have a little primer on trust as we start. Any trust has 5 elements to it. The first element is a grantor. Excuse me. A grantor is a legal word that means an owner. That grantor grants corpus or property to a trustee. Finally, we get to a word we recognize. A trustee, somebody who should be faithful and capable to manage that property according to the set of terms. And those terms have 2 parts to it: how it's to be managed during the life of the trust, and then the distribution. And that's all reduced to writing in a contract. So a simple illustration is a children's trust. Up until 5 years ago, my wife Willette and I had a children's trust. But 2 things happened. Sarah got married and turned 25, so she didn't need it. But up until that time, had something to happen to us, we as the grantors would have granted our property or corpus to a friend of ours as the trustee, and he should be faithful and available and capable to manage it according to set of terms: health, education, maintenance, and support, and then make the distribution that we determined. He should just be faithful and available to manage it. He follows the terms during the life of the trust, health, education, maintenance, support, and then make the distribution that we determined. And then that's all reduced to writing in a contract. Basically, excuse me, what a trust does, a trust says, Mr. Trustee, the owner says, if you'll manage my property according to these set of terms and make the distribution that I've determined, I'm going to compensate you accordingly. So we understand here the elements of a trust. Owner, property, trustee, terms, distribution, and a contract. Now here is the preacher's pregnant pause. Didn't I just explain our stewardship trust before God? Who's the owner of all? The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the people and all who live in it. How many of you believe God's the owner of all? If you didn't raise your hand, you didn't probably understand the question, right? Whatever verse we look at, the cattle on 1,000 hills, a number of places David in the Psalms talk about everything comes from God. I like to quote a verse, sort of paraphrase in 2 Corinthians. We're not our own. We've been bought with a price. We really don't own anything. God is the owner of all. Corpus. I love this verse because I've seen it change business people's lives. You may say to yourself that the power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me, but remember the Lord your God. He's the one who gives thee the ability to produce wealth. Think about natural giftedness. Let's add to that education. Add to that life experience. Isn't that how we have to provide and protect our family? Isn't the Lord the one that gives you the ability to produce wealth? Where do we see this change business people's lives? Oftentimes, if they come to closure on God's given them more than they need, God's given them more than they need to give their family, they really have to ask themselves a question, why did God give it to them? Now, we don't say it trustee, we call it, we got to get some rules straight here. I know Mike asked a rhetorical question or John asked a rhetorical question from up here, but I like a little dialogue. We can talk. So we don't call it trustees. We call it, very good, thank you. So the men are regarded as servants of Christ, entrusted with the secret things of God. Now it's been required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. And there's terms. If you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? But we said there's how many sets of terms? What's the answer? 2, right? How it's to be managed during the life of the trust. But then there's a distribution. See, I would maintain to you, most stewardship is taught about the terms during the life of the trust, right? Master your money, financial peace, crown ministry, even the sermons you hear are mostly about giving. But what about the distribution clause of our stewardship trust before God? See, if we look at it this way, your document, your will, living trust, whatever you use to transfer property is nothing more than the distribution clause of your stewardship trust before God. Therefore, estate planning is spiritual before it's mechanical. Shouldn't the owner make that distribution? Again, what I would say is, your document, your will, is nothing more than the distribution clause of your stewardship trust before God. Therefore, estate planning is spiritual before it's mechanical. That's why in this setting, in what we do in our partner relations department, we don't tell people who to give to or how to give. Now, there are other settings, people at Mission of the World, they'll ask you to support missionaries or projects or so forth. This is a gift back to help people find God's plan of stewardship for the distribution of their estate. That's the ministry that Tim and I have at Mission of the World, is help people find their plan for distribution of their estate. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, give you a hope in a future. Estate planning is spiritual before it's mechanical. And then the verse that ties us together, a verse in Scripture 3 different places. God sends Isaiah to King Hezekiah. In those days, Hezekiah was ill and at the point of death. The prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, went to him and said, this is what the Lord says, put your house in order, for you're going to die, you will not recover. Can you imagine being sick in bed and somebody comes up and says, "Put your house in order"? Well, my daughter and son-in-law who work in youth work say, "He got in his face, Dad." What does it mean to put your house in order? First of all, spiritually, have you reached a point in your spiritual life? If you die today, do you know for certain? I would hope. If you have doubts about that, there's a number of us who would be willing to talk to you. What about relationally? Are all your relationships in the best order that you could make them? Many estate plans fail not because they didn't pass a lot of money on to family, avoided probate, avoided taxes, maybe made large charitable gifts. But the plan failed because the family split because the family can't split grandma's quilt. People are more important than the dollars. The reason why Mission of the World and a lot of other ministries like Cru, etc., use this lifestyle giving design service is because woven throughout this design are a lot of questions to help eliminate interpersonal contact. We'll talk a little about that in a minute. Now, quick question. Did King Hezekiah die? Huh? We're not sure. Some people, yeah, he did die, right? He got how many years? What? Give her one of these roses or something. 15 years. Here's my point. See, we put our house in order, November the 7th, affirmed that it's in order, and knowing as things change and property change and plans change, you can change it. Most of the work we do is revocable until the death of the survivor. Again, so the question to you today, and this is a rhetorical question, do your documents financially, do they represent what you believe the Lord would have you to do? This ministry is help you be affirmed or to make changes you might change. Has much changed in your life in the last 18 months? We've been really busy lately because a lot of changes because of COVID and other things. The market's up, a lot of real estate's being sold, concern for taxes next year. A lot of these things can be, we can help people work through the process of what should their estate look like at this particular season of life. So again, that's our goal here, is to help people find God's plan of stewardship for the distribution of their estate. Now let's look at distribution here. There's only three places that money can go when we no longer have it. It goes to where? Family, right? Now, one of the ways that we help people get around their arms around family is we talk about how much is enough. Do you believe you can give children too much? Older people are going, younger people are going like this, right? One of the ways that we've learned, and another topic here is stewardship doesn't have dollar signs. You remember the widow at the temple? She tossed in her mites, followed by Pharisees clanging coins into the coffers. What did Jesus say? She did more than these. Stewardship does not have dollar signs. And the reality that the medical world today forces you to have other documents, not just a will, a power of attorney for health care. My wife, she had surgery last year. I couldn't even go in the hospital, but they had my power of attorney so I could at least speak to her if something really had gone south. So there's other things beside that. Again, stewardship doesn't have dollar signs. One of the ways that we've helped people get their arms around this, I learned from my mentor, Ray Line, who really was started this whole philosophy of God, estate planning be spiritual before it's mechanical, is what we call putting it on the table. In your mind's eye, I'd like for you to consider adding up what your estate is. What cash, checking, savings, etc. you might have. Add to that any equity in your home, other real estate, the face value of your life insurance, because that's cash. We pass away, that turns into cash. Securities, retirement accounts, maybe business holdings. Now think about that dollar amount and just reduce it to cash right there in front of you. Now don't look at anybody else, because that's not what God gave you. This is what's in front of you, is what God gave you. Now my first question about that pile of green dollar bills is, whose is it? How many people earlier raised God's the owner of all? Okay. Let's suppose that today you got up from where you're sitting and you left the green dollars there and you immediately went to be with the Lord. How do you think he wants you to divide up his stack of green dollar bills? Now, if you have minor children, dependency is the issue. Provide for those children until they reach the age of accountability that you've determined. But what should that distribution look like? That's, again, what your document should look like for this season of life, and if we say today, even November the 7th. Now, if you've been giving all your life, is it not reasonable that the Lord would have you consider ministry? When we were here the last time and I was meeting with families over in the office building over there, there was one lady that said, I don't know if she's here or not, I would remember her, but she said this was the aha moment in this presentation for her. If you've been giving all your life, is it not reasonable the Lord would have you include your church or other ministries in your state documents? What does he want you to do? Again, now that is a rhetorical question, but again, what does he want you to do? How do we get our arms around that? Well, first of all, think about a tithe. If you've been tithing all your life, tithe. Or some people move a little step ahead. We call it a child of charity. My wife, Willetta, and I have 3 children, 3 girls, Kelly, Megan, Sarah, but we've adopted a 4th, and her name is Charity. I've always believed, since I've been in this field, since I was at Covenant Seminary in 1993, that we should have an equal portion that we give our girls. It's just a percentage, and really, many times, the larger the estate, people say, this is enough for my children, and they can actually give way more at death than they ever give during a lifetime. Pretty much anybody has. Let's take somebody that bought a house maybe across the river over here in the early 70s, and a house maybe paid $100,000 for it. What's it worth today? Plus their life insurance, plus their cash, plus their retirement account. Maybe they had a little inheritance. Let's suppose they have $1 million estate. Now that same person worked for 40 years and is retired now. When he worked, he averaged $25,000 a year. And he tithed off of that. So if he made $25,000 a year, what would he tithe a year? $2,500. And he worked for 40 years. How much would he give? $100,000. Now let's suppose that they come to believe that they should include a tithe in their estate documents. How much will they give? $100,000, just as much as they gave an entire lifetime. Not only that, it's a gift of capital. It can pay off a debt. It can plant a church. It can send missionaries, doing a lot of things more than they ever did by looking at a gift when they no longer need it. You never want to give away anything during your lifetime you might need, but again, is it not reasonable to consider ministry in your estate documents? And then finally, taxes, and we're going to talk here about some ways to avoid taxes. Now, this next section is, I really feel like I'm running through this. I'll have, if you, again, you want to come back tomorrow, we'll have more like an hour and 15 minutes to go through this, and I'm based it in 40 minutes, just trying to hit the high points to it. First thing we've talked about, spiritual before mechanical. How much is enough for children? Can you give them too much? And again, considering ministry. Here we're going to do some of the practical tools involved in estate planning. What do you think of this title? When does that happen? When documents aren't in order. I imagine just a few people in this room, somebody could stand up and tell us a mess where the documents weren't in order. I'm going to look at a couple cases here. This is a young family, 3 children. She's homeschooling. The husband's the only worker. They had no documents, so they needed to put in a basic estate plan. You notice up there, and you have the outline to it there if you can see it. They have a will. They needed powers of attorney for property and health care. We also, and we don't sell life insurance, but we also said maybe you might look at to a little more insurance. Something happened to him to raise 3 children. Then the other 2 things they had to look through is guardianship and a trust for children. This is just a template that if something happens to both of them, that the assets go into a children's trust. This is a template that says, by state law, it's either 18 or 19, depending on what state you're in, when children would get their inheritance. So this is a postponed distribution to protect them. Maybe they get a third of it at age 25, half at 28, and the balance at 30. And then how to choose guardians. Sometimes that's a separate person, a bifurcated responsibility. Somebody manages the money, somebody raises the children. This is a little extra that we've come up, a paradigm about how to pick guardians. First of all, Christian world and life view. How can siblings that don't know the Lord raise up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord? What's their Christian world life view? What's their views of education? Think of the only time I ever use this word is plethora. Think of the plethora of choices of education. What are they today? There's homeschool, public school, private school, Christian school, charter school, reform school. Think of, do their views on education line up with yours? And then what about their parenting skills? Are their children running up and down the halls here at church yelling and screaming? Or are those yours? No. What are their parenting skills? And what's the role of grandparents? I have come to believe that the role of grandparent is to spoil grandchildren, not necessarily raise them. Don't get me wrong, my wife and our oldest daughter lives in Australia and have two granddaughters there, and my wife and I are still the guardians for them. My younger daughters both have children, and they're for each other, but my older daughter feels like it'd be best for us, at least for this season of life. But in a few years, when those girls get to be teenagers and something happens, I'm not sure I want to be a parent for a teenage girl again. But anyway, thinking through these things, there's a lot of things that are never thought about. And then this is a more complicated estate plan here. This is where a family was, this is many times where we work with people. Their documents are 10 or 15 years old, and they just need to be updated and reviewed. And this had guardianship issues in it. Their kids were out of the nest, kids of their own, and they needed to look at it. They lived in a state where the probate process was a little more arduous than it is maybe in South or North Carolina or Georgia, but California, Florida. A lot of states, people need to move to a revocable trust as the basic vehicle. You still have a will, but it's called a pour-over will. It says if there's no property in my name, if there is property in my name when I pass away, put it in the trust. The trust makes the distribution. You still have powers of attorney for property and health care. And again, a power of attorney for health care is very important in this day's world because of HIPAA law and then Obamacare. All our states, you can actually go to a state and pull down one. It's a pro forma power of health care, but it should be updated. Now, the other point here, there was a revocable trust that was created at the death of the survivor, and what that would do would be to provide for the family, it goes into place at the death of the first spouse to guarantee that family gets their inheritance. At one time it was in place to avoid estate taxes. State tax exemption has risen so now most people don't need that anymore, but notice there's one trust created at the death of one spouse to guarantee these children will get that. The other thing I want to point out to you, there is a principle of giving the right asset to the right people. Snapshot in time. Stewardship doesn't have dollar signs. People are more important than dollars. A lot of phrases we use here. This phrase is give the right asset to the right people. I don't see anybody in the room that's over 70 and a half, but if they were, they could tell us what happens to the retirement account when you turn 70 and a half. Now 72, you have to start taking required minimum distributions, okay? So one spouse passes away, the retirement account rolls over. When the survivor passes away, if it goes to family, they have to pay it out now in 10 years. You can no longer stretch it out beyond that. And actually, IRAs are spent within, generally on average, 3 years. That's faster than lottery winnings. So one of the ideas we have here is give the right asset to the right people. This family also decided they wanted 25% of their estate to go to ministry. So what we had them to do is to consider making the contingent beneficiary of the retirement account fund their charitable giving. And in this case, if you notice, the retirement account would go on down to the charitable side because nonprofits, church, other ministries don't pay taxes. So it's a very efficient way of making a charitable distribution is looking to the retirement account assets or any, it's called IRD, income in respect to decedent, any assets would go when you no longer need them. And they can go to a donor advised fund and be split up among your charities and so forth. Just again, that's a good way to make a gift when we no longer need it by the retirement account. Now, I don't have really time to talk about this other than there's a disease in estate planning, and it's called procrastination. Indecision becomes a decision. Oftentimes, we lay our documents on the desk, don't get around to sign them. Busyness of life, I think, puts this decision off. But this is a lady that was in that position. She did do an estate design, and notice what she did, the same thing, is let her retirement account fund her charitable giving. Now I'm going to go into how to give more effectively, and I'm going to have to go through this pretty quickly with the time frame that I have. So I just want to point out several things. First of all, consider giving non-cash assets. Most people write checks in their giving. Consider giving stock or mutual funds, or even real estate or business interest, and all be given through our relationships with some of the large Christian foundations. We can show you even how to sell or give away S Corp and LLC. Cash stock is easy enough. A few years ago, I did a seminar in McLean, Virginia, and a lady came forward. She's writing about 5 figures of gifts every year and writing checks for it. She loved Apple stock. Loved it. And her husband had passed away, and she had a lot of it. And what we proposed to her, why don't you give this Apple stock instead of giving, because it appreciated, just literally 25 cents on the dollar is how much it appreciated. Why don't you give your Apple stock? And he said, she's going to do that. And then I said, if you like Apple stock that much, then just take the cash you were writing in checks and buy back the Apple stock at the higher basis, and if you sell it, you won't have that much capital gains. That's called a charitable swap. My whole point here is consider giving non-cash assets. Tim and I have been busier in the last 3 months than we've been in the last 3 years because we've seen gifts of real estate because the market's so high, and also gifts of stock because that market's so high. Can we help you facilitate that to make it a tax-smart gift? Strategic plans for business owners, there's 2 there. If you have an LLC or an S Corp, we can show you how to give that and sell it, or give and hold. And tax law opportunity means opportunity. I'm just going to touch on these 3 laws. First of all, in 2017, that law did something for many people. So they no longer are doing itemizing, they're doing the standard deduction. So what came about, an idea then, was called bunching. Several of the people that I met with here in the church last time, they started bunching, where you do your giving for 3 years in 1 year, and take whatever you can take, the mortgage, somebody's nodding their head here, take whatever, mortgage interest, state taxes, and that year you go ahead and itemize. Then you take the money, generally in a donor advised fund, and give it to the church or other ministries the next year, and you take the standard deduction. And it's actually, you have more cash by thinking of giving. The other thing that it did, it raised the estate tax exemption up to $22 million for a couple. Now it looks like that's going to drop down here with this law that just passed. That's going to drop down, but that's a topic for another time. It also meant that we can do required minimum distributions, can do qualified charitable deductions. I know the church takes qualified charitable deductions rather than having to take your RMD. You give it directly to the church or other ministries. Last year, what happened is people over 70 and a half did not have to take RMD, and they make a rise that you could give up to 100% of your adjusted gross income and fully deductible, and that stayed in this year too. The other thing that they did is to make last year that if your standard deduction, you can take $300 more, and then this year you can take $600 more above your standard deduction and deduct that on your 1040. Notice there's no line there under 2022 because we don't know what's going to happen, but we do believe there will be higher taxes in income taxes, capital gains taxes, and the estate tax exemption will be lowered. Now I'm going to do two fast things here about how to give more effectively by using, first of all, a donor-advised fund. Most of your Missional World does donor-advised funds. The PCA Foundation does donor-advised funds. Most of your brokerage houses do donor-advised funds. It's where you make a gift and you get a deduction in the year that you make the gift, a stock, cash, etc. And then you get to give advice when it goes, where it goes, how much it goes. You don't have to give it in that year. You can wait till later. A lot of times people are retiring and they got a bonus or a deferred compensation account, and they had a big income that year, so they give a bunch away to mitigate income, and then they're going to give it away later on. Also, it can be used as a sort of a private family foundation. It could be funded from your retirement account or your will or trust. When you no longer need it, it goes into the donor advised fund, and you have a letter that says, at my death, do the following. I want to support these missionaries. I want this to go to my church. I want this to go to navigators, this to go to crew, whatever. And then you're still alive. It hasn't been funded yet, but you change churches. Well, instead of going back to your attorney and have him redraft the document, you can just change your letter at the donor advised fund. It can even be used as a good legacy tool to help children in legacy giving. Selling with it, this will cost too much. I don't have time to use both of my examples that I have. This is a charitable remainder trust. If you have real estate or stock that you've wanted to sell, you can transfer it to that trust, charitable trust, and it can sell it with no depletion of capital gains because eventually the property is going to go to a tax-exempt organization, so it can sell it with no depletion of capital gains. You get to take an income for life, and you get a tax deduction during your lifetime for what you're planning to do at death. So another way we look at real estate is what we call a zero tax sale. This is a physician in North Carolina. He had sold his practice, and he still owned the building. The building was worth $1 million, but it had been depreciated 3 years down to $200,000. If he sold it, he was going to pay $230,000 in taxes. He would have tithed off that, and he would have had $692 left. Instead, what we asked him to consider is a zero tax sale. We ran the numbers, talked to his CPA, and it worked out that if he would give away 36% of an undivided interest deeded into a donor advised fund before he sold it, and he did that, then it was listed, can't have a contract, by the way, with this, then it was listed, and what happened is, on the amount that he gave away, and then it sold, by the way, on the amount he gave away, he got a tax deduction for doing that, charitable income tax deduction. On the amount he kept, he owed taxes. He used the tax deduction to offset the capital gains, and he had a zero tax sale. You might say, well, Bruce had a little less. Yeah, he had a little less in his pocket, but he had a lot more in his charitable account. He's funding his giving for a lot of years simply by looking at one of these situations. This is not smoke and mirrors. This is mainstream, mainline charitable planning. I did a seminar in Bonita Springs one time. They had it at a country club. I was sitting sort of over here before I got up where Mike's sitting, and they were talking about that school down there where they go like this, football. They're talking about football. They said, if you want one seat on the 50-yard line, what level donor for football games, what level donor did you need to be? They said 25,000. So if you needed 4 seats, what level of donor did you need to be? 100,000. Now, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of very charitable people that give to their alma maters, and even in churches and mission giving, so forth. Here's my point. That state educational institution has people that are trained with these same tools that Tim and I are. And what they'll do is they'll call on that man, say, Mr. Alumni, Mr. Donor, here's how you can give to us by using this tool here, given sales, zero tax sale, and so forth. The difference is we brought these same complex tools right down in the safe setting of the church for people to examine whether you'd like to do them or not. How you can take advantage of that, I think, is you can fill out that form that says how to receive these services. We've got paper inventories. If you want, we'll send you an electronic inventory, or you can meet with Tim and I tomorrow afternoon. We've got some sign-up sheets, and what we'll do, we'll process it, put it on the table, ask you where you are, and then we'll bring back to you the design, which has very similar to the pages that we looked at a while ago. And so again, if you want to receive these services, that's how you do. I had asked my friend Frank if he went through this process when he was here last year, and I asked Frank if he would just come up and say just a couple words about this process, how it worked for him.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Frank Stafford. When Bruce was here several years ago, Jill and I already had a will. It was a simple one specifying that the first of us to die would leave everything to the other, and the second to die would leave it all to the children. It was drawn up in 1993 under the old tax laws, so it was seriously out of date. I knew we needed to update it, but it was easy to procrastinate. In the course of our conversation with Bruce, we were impressed to learn that we could, in the new will, we could not only leave an inheritance to our children, but could also leave some to the work of the Lord's kingdom. And this is important, in doing so, could minimize taxes. That tax saving was a big attraction. After all, we thought, wouldn't it be better to leave what Bruce calls an inheritance to worthy ministries rather than to the government? It seemed like a no-brainer to me. So we had a tax attorney draw up a new will and specified a percentage of the estate, that a percentage of the estate would be donated to various ministries or 501c3 charities. Of this amount, we were able to specify which ministries would receive this and how much each would receive. MTW would distribute these funds according to our instructions. Naming these ministries was very simple. All it took was a letter to MTW listing who gets and how much. And it's also easy to make changes to this list if you need to, simply by writing a new letter. This is important. For instance, if one missionary should retire and no longer need support and a new missionary comes into service. So in summary, this arrangement lets a portion of our estate pass to the work of God's kingdom with maximum advantage. I'm glad we did this, and if any of you have been procrastinating like I was on getting your will up to date, I recommend that you seriously consider it. I think it's a great idea.
Thank you, Frank. Let's give Frank a hand.
Did you want to say anything else, Bruce? Or
No, I'm
Okay.
good. Just again, you're going to go through how to
Yes.
receive the services and what the schedule is.
Great. There's two ways to receive these services. First of all, you can pull your church app up, and at the top of the app, you're going to see just what we call an announcement at the top of it that just has a house in order. You can complete the form there. There's 4 options. There's the 3 that you see here in front of you, which says, I'd like to receive more information. Please contact me. And then also for estate design purposes, I'd like to receive a guide to planning. There's one additional option on the app, which is tomorrow, as Bruce suggested. He's set aside some time to meet with individuals or couples tomorrow. If you click that you'd like to meet with them tomorrow, we're going to review those list of names today, and we're going to provide some options for you to meet with Bruce and Tim tomorrow. So take a moment to do that if you would, and we'll set those up this afternoon for you. And finally, Bruce is going to be at the table after Sunday school. You can meet with him there. He will also be there after the 11 o'clock service. And then tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in Murphy Hall, you can follow up. This presentation, it can be contracted down to 45 minutes. He would really probably want it over an hour to discuss what to do. I'll just leave with one little personal testimony about myself. Several of us who are maybe younger, the thought of these estates and the size of them and distributions, it just isn't where we're at. However, what Bruce really did help me to see, I went through the process, is both where there were holes in my current plan that I had, and he helped me to begin to secure those up. And also, as I worked through the plan, I went and had conversations with my parents. And they actually went and talked to their attorneys, and they made some changes in their plans as well as a result of this. So really, no matter what age you're at, this is a great exercise to go through, and also really began to give me a vision for in the years to come when I find myself in the place of making these types of plans. It allowed me to see what categories. Much of it I know can be confusing as he works through this, but what I hope you see is the knowledge that he has combined with the faith to pull this together, and I would encourage all of you to do it. I spoke with one member who had very meticulously done this before, but he said that Bruce affirmed the plan that we were on, and they gave us great courage to move ahead. Most people go through it and they make some needed updates. This is a free service that they provide for you, and I just can't encourage you enough to say take advantage of this. Talk to Bruce afterwards. Fill out the form on your app. If you fill out the sheet of paper, just give it to Bruce at the table, and we will make an appointment with you. But this is a wonderful service that they provide for our church. Anything else, Bruce?
Do we have any time?
Maybe, if it's a minute.
A minute?
Yes.
You know, I like to close this presentation with an illustration that I learned from my mentor. It's called hugs. Is this a hugging church? Was it before COVID? Yeah, it was? Okay. 3 kind of hugs. First of all, the hug from the Father, that when you go to be the Lord, he puts his arms around you and says, well done, my good and faithful servant, steward. Secondly, that your family's still hugging each other 3 days, 30 years, 3 years after you've gone to be with the Lord. To the best of your ability, you've eliminated interpersonal conflict that arise. And the third hug is from somebody that you don't know. Scripture says that we will have new bodies, but we'll be able to recognize each other. And somebody gives you a hug, and they, who are you? Say, well, do you remember the money that you left for the church? The church used that money to plant another church, and they had a youth worker, and he came out on the field day after day after day and told me about Jesus. And I'm here because of what you did. May you receive all the hugs that are due you, the Father, your family, and the family of God. Father, we thank you for this time. I pray, thank you for the truth of redemption, and we pray that the things that people have heard here, you would allow them to just, in their discipleship, in their stewardship, to be able to grow and hear well done from you. And we ask it in your name. Amen. Thank you.